Okay, it's recording. Alright. He is 83 years old. And he's lived a very long life, so let's see what he's got to say.
Okay. Well, I was born at Willard Ohio Hospital, May 3rd, 1935. And my parents were Keith Gooding, my father, and my mother was Doris Gooding. And they were both musicians and were kind enough to foster my musical education, and they sure did. They backed me every step of the way. In fact, they even had me start working at the age of 6 years old, singing with their band. I was a boy soprano. I actually began as an amateur. I won my first amateur contest when I was 4. They used to have amateur contests up on the square in Plymouth, where I lived, and there was a bandstand there, and I guess they would have different acts or people that would play or sing, and somehow I won first place. And from that point on, I guess they used to have me in different programs for different churches and service organizations that would have amateur contests. Back in the 1930s, there wasn't the entertainment choice that you have today. But what you did when you went to a movie, you got not only the movie, you usually got a double feature. You got a cartoon, you got a newsreel, and in between the double feature, you got a band on stage, a live band on stage. And you got all this for probably 10 cents. This was during the hard times. This was during the Depression.
The Great Depression?
Yeah.
Okay.
All through the 30s.
How old were you in the Great Depression?
I would have been right in about I came into it about halfway through. 1935 would have been probably about halfway through it.
Okay.
And of course, at that time we were pretty close to World War II. In fact, we were already at war with Germany, I think, and probably just about ready to go to war with Japan. So we're talking 1941 here.
Yeah.
When I would be 6 years old. And so I would do my shtick, and I'd usually have on either war.
Yeah.
So, of course, after December 7th, 1941, there went that gig because my dad went to the Army. It wasn't very long. Four months later, he enlisted.
Did he say why?
Yes, he did. I asked him long time later after I came back to live with him. I said, "Why did you enlist, Dad?" I said, "You had a wife and a son." I said, "You could have gotten exempt status." He says, "I thought it would be easier to face Adolf Hitler than your grandmother."
Wow.
because he and my grandmother were absolutely never.
You,
Yeah,
without
she
it.
probably was. But anyway, that was the deal on that. But they had me out for a moonlight stroll in my stroller, I guess, or in my buggy. Then they didn't have strollers. And I looked up and saw the moon, and that was my first word, was moon. And I said, moon. So I've always been fascinated with the moon and with the stars. And there is no such a thing as coincidence. They also say, whoever they are. And here my daughter up and marries a rocket science and works at Cape Kennedy for 33 years and him almost 38. So it all kind of ties in. So I piano,
Nice.
which turned out to be the second piano that Mom and I played. And we went around and started talking to, or started playing all the other ones and kept coming back to that second piano. So then, after that, when it came home and they set it up in the music room, I couldn't let it alone. It had the most wonderful sound of any piano I had ever heard. And to this day, that would still apply. It's just one of the most.
What did your dad? What was he like when he was in the war?
What was he like in the? My dad was probably very efficient. My dad is a handyman. He's kind of like your dad. He could just about give him anything that nobody else could fix, and he'd figure out a way to jerry-rig it so that it would work.
That's great.
Now, this is a typical this is a description of my dad to a T, because he had a very dry, wry sense of humor. When he first went into the service, they put him in the medical corps after he got out of basic training.
Yeah.
Or at least maybe that was his cover, I don't know. It turned out that he became part of a 25-man team of recon. But you had to, the catch was you had to be a college graduate to get into that clique. My dad got through high school, but that's as far as he'd ever gotten. So the guy that was asking the questions, he says, "Did you go to college?" And Dad says, "Yeah, I went in the front door and out the back. Click, college graduate." So, the strange thing about it is, every one of those 24 out of 25 guys, those college graduates, they didn't know how to do anything except what they learned in college. So anytime they needed anything jerry-rigged, guess who got the job?
Grandpa.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And also they knew that he was very good at acquiring things. So he was kind of gopher. They'd send him as a gopher for anything that they ever needed when he was in the Army. Including AWOL soldiers. He went, after the war, he went to Paris, found these two guys, and he took them back. He took them back to the unit, so they wouldn't get court-martialed.
Wow.
But that's the way my dad was. They could find him. Now he had the funniest thing in the world. Speaking of after the war experiences, I'll tell you some during the war experience, but this is just a funny one that happened after the war.
Okay.
To kind of go back a little bit, Dad's mother died delivering him,
Oh my God.
so he
I didn't know.
never got to know his mother.
Oh, that's sad.
I know, it makes me sad to tell it. So what happened is his dad, my Grandpa Gooding, sent him down to be with his parents, Grandpa Gooding's mom and dad.
Okay.
They raised my dad. And they did a very good job of it too, I might add.
Yes, they did.
But anyway, I got off the track and I forgot my point that I was going to make. Oh, this little funny story. So Dad, it turned out, had four, what would they call them, half brothers, because his dad got married pretty close to right after his mother died.
Half brothers, yeah.
But I don't. There's only one that he ever had any kind of close affiliation with. That was Larry.
Okay.
But one of them, it turned out, unbeknownst to Dad until later in life, was over in the same area of Germany that Dad was. Now this is after the war's over, and Dad for a while was with Patton's Third Army, and probably with the recon unit.
Yeah.
And Jeep went by. They were along the road, him and this lieutenant, I think it was, Dad and this lieutenant.
Yeah.
And Patton goes by, and they didn't salute. So goes down the road, the car turns around. I guess Dad and this lieutenant were in a Jeep. Jeep turns around, starts to come back. So Dad said, "Do you realize that we did not salute Patton?" And the lieutenant says, "You better get the hell out of here." So Dad did. He took off in the Jeep. He had that thing wide open. So, and it turns out they came to this bridge and he went down under the bridge and parked, and Patton went on. Now later on he found out who Patton's driver was. Now you want to talk about irony. It's one of his half-brothers. And I guess they had quite a hoot and a holler over that day when Dad found out years later that it was his own half-brother chasing him, and by God, he didn't catch him either.
Nice, Grandpa Keith.
Yeah, that is definitely Grandpa Keith. He, for a while, he was stationed in England before they went over for the landing of the Battle of D-Day.
Okay.
He was on the D-Day landing.
And
Trying to think
that
which
was
beach it was.
That was the beach of Normandy, correct?
I think he might have been at the one on Omaha, or there was one other one. It wasn't the Normandy beachhead, but it was one of them.
Okay.
Might have been Omaha.
Okay.
But he was there. But before he went there, they were stationed at a base in England, and they would send him on these gopher things for whatever supplies or something they needed that they didn't have, and they knew that he wouldn't lose any time going there and coming back bringing it. So they'd send him. So he and one of his buddies were on a gopher trip, going up into the middle part of England. And it was kind of early in the morning, and they were hungry, and they were kind of looking for a little place to pub. They call them pubs over there.
Yeah.
Maybe an IHOP over there, but you know, it wasn't IHOP. It was a pub. But they came across this one, and they went in, and this beautiful receptionist came. Now, I'm not convinced that this actually happened or whether they fell asleep and dreamed this. Because it seems it's a chapter right out of Twilight Zone.
I've heard this story before.
Yes, you have heard
I was
that
10 years
story.
old.
Yeah.
I remember it so clearly.
So your mother kind of thinks they might have just fallen asleep or had one beer too many in the pub and fell asleep and dreamed this. But since you've heard the story, I'll spare you that. But
I'd like to hear it again.
okay.
I love
So
it.
they went in, and they were greeted by this very beautiful receptionist. And she took them over and sat them down at the table and asked them what they wanted. Now, this was wartime, so a lot of things were rationed, especially in Europe. And what happened was they brought them both the most beautiful platter of ham and eggs. And you just don't get ham and eggs in 1944 in England during the war. You might have got fish and chips if you were lucky. But he got the most beautiful plate of ham and everything that went with it on the house, of course. And so when they left, they went back to the base and delivered what they had picked up. And then they were on another trip maybe a week or so later, and they were up in the general area, same area. There was one thing that did happen before that I left out. Just as they were about to go into the restaurant, a B-24 crash landed in the field next to them.
Wow.
And I think nobody survived.
Oh, goodness.
Now, whether that caused a time warp or something, or if this thing really did happen, I'm wondering if that had something to do with putting them in a time warp or something.
It may have. Because there's been stories known about people getting plane crashes and then going back in time.
Well, of course, they weren't in the plane crash, but it was fairly close to them. You know, it was in the field next to them.
Mm-hmm.
So when they went back a week or so later to try and find this place, they found a place where this place was, and there was an old farmer there. And they said, well, what happened to this place? Did it get bombed? And the old farmer says, what place? They said, well, there was a restaurant here a week ago. We went in and had ham and eggs. He says, this place hasn't been open for 300 years.
Wow.
And they said, well, yes, it was. It was there a week ago. And they couldn't convince him that they were there eating ham and eggs. And he couldn't convince them that they weren't. So it was a very strange story, but it stuck in my mind because my dad had a very unique way of telling a story. He was very good at it.
You were good at
He
it.
could weave quite a tale.
Yes, you could.
So how much was editing and how much was real, I don't know. Anyway, he had a lot of adventures like that. But I took him to see, just on a lark, when I had moved back here to live with him after I failed my third marriage.
We'll
I
go
took him to
that
see.
too.
No, okay. So I took him to see Saving Private Ryan, because I wanted his critique on the
movie
accuracy, authenticity
of it.
it.
Yeah.
So when we got home after watching the movie, I started asking him about it. He started to kind of smile, and I said, "Was it authentic, Dad?" He said, "It wasn't even close." He said, you and no one else would ever be able to go through it, and they would never be able to show what I saw." He said, "No, I'm sorry." He said, "Not even close."
Wow.
He said, "The one thing you couldn't get is the sound of the screams and the different body parts floating around." It was awful. And Dad, as a result, very seldom I could get him to talk about anything like that in the war. He'd talk about funny experiences or something.
But nothing horrific like that.
No, I think it was too much for him. Now, when he first came home from the Army, for about a year, every night was night terrors. I think you know what I mean by night terrors.
Yep.
He was right in the middle of the war.
So, do you think he had PTSD too?
Oh, absolutely. They called it battle fatigue in those rooms.
Yeah.
I'm glad you made that comment, because he went into battle fatigue toward the end of the war, and they put him on a train, a hospital train, for 6 months, sent him to Austria.
Wow.
And the train just kept running around Austria. And he never knew where he was. And Mom and I got the telegram that he was missing in action.
Oh, goodness.
And we could hardly handle it. It was really almost too much. And we had to wait 6 months to find out that he was still alive. Thank God.